Record. Oh, hide. It's so hard to read. Okay, I think it's already past birthday time, so we can get started. Oh wait, can I do a second laptop? I wanted speaker notes. Oh, chill, chill. Okay, cool. So it's week 8. Today we'll be doing JavaScript. We kind of have a lot of content. Why is not? We have a lot of content to get through, but first announcements. Yeah, this week, or sorry, we will resume our weekly homework, starting with, homework 8, and that'll be due next Thursday, kind of with our regular schedule. Same with lab, that'll be next Monday, and I think that might be wrong. We will start lab again next Monday. For project grades, we'll send out a report, hopefully like by the beginning of next week. So yeah, look out for an email or post on Ed. And then final project will be released soon. Okay, so cool. So far we've done like HTML and CSS, and luckily we've like finished, or we've like learned everything that we will regarding those two. And now we will move into JavaScript. Pretty much, yeah, you guys have already like used or like learned a lot about how to make like nice looking websites, formatted, layout. But with JavaScript, we'll be able to implement more like interactive functionality. And that's kind of what we'll get into today. So a few questions we'll have and will be answered throughout this lecture are, what is JavaScript? What can we do with it? What does it look like? And we'll kind of get started seeing like what we, or how to use it. Okay, yeah, so pretty much HTML and CSS are just like to lay out the structure and format what we have, whereas JavaScript, we can control the behavior of certain elements. It's pretty different from what we've learned so far, but it's not scary. So let's get into it. Yeah, so you guys may have like kind of heard, but it's JavaScript in like recent years has become more of like a general programming language. You can even do like coding interviews with it, but for the sake of this course, we'll only use it to like manipulate stuff on web pages. So yeah. Yeah. So if you ever have like been on a website where you have like, I guess, pop-up dialogues or image carousels. Image carousels are just like those like sliding things that you can like click an arrow and like slide images through. That's all done with JavaScript. So yeah, there's currently no way to do that in like, or maybe there's a way to do it in CSS, but it's a lot easier in JavaScript. Okay, did I skip? Yeah, so for the majority of this lecture, there's definitely gonna be moments where like, I will like explain a concept that might seem like trivial, or maybe their use cases are kind of like hard to see at first. But like, don't stress. I think because we're learning a whole like programming language, we're like entering that like uncomfortable part of the learning curve. So do not worry about it. Yeah, basically I'll try to like walk you through this so that we can construct like a mental model of what's happening so that you can use this in the future. Yeah. But basically, yeah, this slide outlines like the 3 major parts we want to keep in mind whenever we're implementing features. The idea is you want to first think of a feature that you want to add to your web page. And the 3-part like structure we're going to use is what like thing do we want the user to click or interact with somehow? Like, what is that? Just identify it. And when we click it or like interact with it somehow, what is it going to change? Are we going to add something? Are we going to remove something? And will we be changing it in the HTML or the CSS? So yeah. This is kind of what you want to think about before you even like start coding. This is just like good practice. Okay, let's walk through some examples. I'll give you guys the first one, and then there's like 3 more, and we'll try to get some like participation going. So yeah. So for example, following this like color coding from before, right? We want to think when the user clicks on this image, you want to increase its size. That's like the English, right? But if we want to translate this into how we might implement this with code, increase its size can be translated roughly to maybe changing its CSS width property, right? So you can see how changing that would translate to increasing its size and so on and so forth. Okay, so with this next one, feel free to raise your hand and just like take a guess. When the user clicks on a button, we're going to change the colors to dark mode. So I guess to break this down, let me see. Yeah, just to break it down, let's think what CSS properties would we need to like change, and like how would we, like what would we change them to? Does anyone have any guesses? Okay, yeah. Yeah, exactly. So for example, if we have like, if our default mode is light mode, we have like a background color set to white originally, and our text maybe to some dark color, right? When we change the CSS, this could be, like you said, changing the CSS color and background color, maybe background of like a really dark gray and then text color of white, right? One more, this one might need a hint. When the user clicks on like a certain tab, then change the content displayed. So let's say we have like a block of text, right? There's like 2 tabs, and whichever one is like active, that will determine what text is shown. Do we have any guesses what we can do here? This one's a little tougher. Okay, I'll just go through it because it's kind of hard. But changing the content might be, and again, there's like multiple ways of like implementing these like features. But one way we can do this is possibly hide the first div and show the second div. And what we can do to make that happen is with CSS, set the display to none for the first one and maybe display block to the second one. So maybe originally, like when we first open the web page, or sorry, when we first load up the web page, the first div will have like display block, and then the second one will have display none. So that kind of controls what's shown and what's not shown. So you can kind of maybe lead into seeing how we can use JavaScript to do this. And the last one, I'll just like give it because it's kind of hard, but if the user clicks on an up arrow, we increase the number. Basically, what we can do is we can take, like basically grab the number that's inside a div in the HTML file, add 1 to it outside using JavaScript, and then change the div to this new number. So basically updating these values and then displaying that. Yeah, so those are some like concrete examples of what we can do with JavaScript. This is like what we can do. We haven't like talked about, and we won't talk about for this lecture, how to do it per se. This is mostly just an introduction to like syntax and whatnot. Okay, so yeah, this is kind of what we already talked about. I don't think this is anything new. But yeah, pretty much HTML and CSS, like when you load up a web page, everything that you've already written like will show up for the most part, right? Like if you wrote text from in your file, it'll be there, it'll be present. And then CSS, whatever styles you applied, that'll also be present. Whereas with JavaScript, it's going to require some like interaction from the user's end, some like input, whether it's like a mouse click or a scroll, for you to really see the JavaScript in action. Yeah. So yeah, for now, we're just going to say it lives in the console. Don't worry, this is like very hand wavy and like abstract, but we'll cover that again later. And yeah, there's a Chrome like dev tool that literally is called the console, where you can like maybe see what your JavaScript is doing. But for now, we won't really touch HTML or like how it interacts with the HTML. Okay. So similar to how we like link a CSS file to our HTML, we need to use like, well, I mean, sorry, with CSS, we use like the link tag, whereas with JavaScript, we're going to use script. Also, just like standard naming conventions, your JavaScript file should be called like script.js. JS is just short for JavaScript. Yeah, this will happen. You'll add this at the right after the closing body tag. And then just follow this format script. You can pretty much like copy paste this. The one thing you want to be careful about though is, I know some students had issues kind of earlier on in the semester. Make sure that the file path is correct. So what this file path indicates, like this doesn't work for everything. This is not like a universal. But what this is indicating is that your script.js file lives in a JS folder, and that lives in an assets folder, and that assets folder lives in the same thing that contains this HTML. So if you have different names, make sure you update it appropriately. But yeah, just kind of a review for file pathing. And yes, there is a closing tag. I think that's different from the link. Okay. Yeah, so for today's concepts, we're just going to go through like variables, which are very similar to how we think of variables in math. Basically, little symbols are like ways of storing data. I think for the most part, we'll just use like numbers and like text. Console log and alert, don't worry about that right now. We'll see it in the slides. Strings are a type of data. Sorry, they are a data type that stores text. So variables can be strings. And lastly, functions. And functions are kind of like the meat of JavaScript. It's where we get to like define the behavior that we want for our, like whatever feature we want. And we will definitely spend a lot of time on that. And at the end of this, hopefully we'll be able to like read the syntax of JavaScript, kind of understand what each part does, and then do math. Sure. So an introduction to variables. There's like in programming, because JavaScript is a general programming language, we're definitely going to draw on a lot of like general programming concepts. There's like two key parts to creating variables. There are these terms called declaration and initialization. So declaration essentially tells the program or our compiler about the existence of something, right? We're just saying like, hey, there's going to be a variable. You haven't told it what it is yet or what data it stores, what type of data and what value that is. You're just saying there exists some variable, right? Initialization is that second part, and that will assign a value to this. So that can be a number, it can be some text, and it'll assign it to that corresponding entity. Okay. So just to connect this to a more like relatable example that we may have seen in math class or in some of your math classes, maybe in like proofs, you might have seen statements like let k be 5, for example, right? So to connect this back to this concept of like declaration and initialization, the declaration is like analogous to this let k. Alone, let k doesn't mean anything, but it's telling our brains that there is a variable called k that will have maybe some value in the future, and we will have to reference it eventually. So that's like declaration. And then initialization is that other part, which is B5. And again, alone doesn't really mean anything, but when you connect it to what variable you just assigned that value to, you're telling it this variable that initially had nothing assigned to it is now going to be attached to this value. Oh, sorry, the other way around. The value is attached to this variable. So that's kind of like a real life example. Pretty much most, I say not all, because there are some like cases in which you can't, but most variables can be redeclared and their values can be like reassigned, right? So you can kind of, redeclaration is not really used and it will cause some problems, but reassigning is useful if you want to like continue to update your variable. So I guess an example of like reassigning could be that idea that we saw of like increasing your number by 1 inside that div. That could be an example of where you might want to reassign your variable. Okay, so yeah, we already said it's like math. So this is kind of the syntax that we use to declare and initialize our variables. You can see the cursor. Yeah, okay. So this keyword let is essentially saying that we're creating a variable. So again, let x or like let k. In this case, we're saying let name. So name is the name of our variable. Conveniently, we're saying let name. So that's our declaration part equals Joe. And in quotes is letting us, or sorry, by using quotes, we're telling the compiler that this is text. It's important to use quotes if you want to create like strings or store text. If you don't use quotes, it'll look for a variable with that name. So keep that in mind. So again, just reiterating on the structure, let name is our declaration. We're saying, hey, there's a variable that's called name. Equals Joe is giving this variable a value of Joe. So if we ever reference name in the future in this program, it will have that value of Joe. Okay, and similarly, we can assign numbers to variables. So same concept here, creating a variable, giving it a name, and storing a value, in this case, a number. One thing that is like pretty important to note is good practice for programming is you always want to give your names make it meaningful. Like it should correspond to what it like actually does in the program. So using like X and Y maybe might be convenient because it's easy to type, but in the future when you're working with it, you might forget what it even meant in the first place. So make sure you're descriptive with it without being like overly excessive. I think it's good to err on the side of describing it more than like leaving ambiguity. So yes. we're going to skip this portion and we'll revisit it at the end just because this is very hard to explain. Okay, but the TLDR is there's 3 different keywords we can use to declare variables. I kind of like skip through it. There's var, let, and const. In the scope of this class, just use let. Again, at the end of this, I'll come back to see why those 3 even exist and why there's a point in even like differentiating between the 3. But for now, just assume we use let. Okay, so string concatenation. We're now moving on to, oh, sorry, let me just like use this as a checkpoint. Do we have any questions on anything that I like taught so far? Anything that's like unclear? Okay, so I'll move on to this. So you may hear this term in the future, but string concatenation is just like, I don't know, like the procedure, like anyway, it's basically you put text together and you add it kind of similar to how you would intuitively think as you would like in English. So remember, text is always in your quotes. You have some examples. So let name equals Nicholas. So remember, let, we're saying create a variable, we're assigning its name to be name, and its value is Nicholas in quotes. Okay. Okay. Ooh. So now we're creating another variable called greeting. Again, it's a string, and we're going to concatenate. So put this text together. We have howdy in quotes. Notice name is not in quotes. This will not have the actual literal value NAME. Instead, it'll look for a variable with that name. So given that we already assigned the value Nicholas to name, do we have any guesses of what this entire string when put together like creates? Anyone want to take a guess? It's like pretty straightforward. Yes. Yeah, good. It's important to note that this space here translates to this space right here. The spaces don't magically appear. They don't like auto format to make the sentence like nice to read. If you forget the space here with after howdy, and you just did like howdy without a space plus name plus exclamation mark, that space would not exist here. It would just be like put together. So it takes like literal values and puts them together. Okay, cool. And yes. And yeah, so again, we won't really see JavaScript show up just yet because we're not like in this lecture, we're not going to connect it to how it like changes the actual HTML and CSS. So for now, to make it show up, we have to use something called console.log. So if you put console.log in your program, in your like JavaScript file, you'll be able to like output or display certain values that you might want to like check the value of. Yeah. So let's say we want to make sure that in this assignment of greeting, we want to make sure that it's as we expected. So we do console.log and in parentheses, the thing that we want to display. Again, we don't really have a way of finding what this value is without using like console.log. And when we have this in our code, it should print out howdy Nicholas. So you won't really encounter a use case for it just yet, but keep in mind console log will be helpful for when you like create your programs and you want to just like for sanity checks, ensure that it's doing what you expect it to. Alert is pretty similar. It's kind of troll. It's a little more interactive and annoying, but essentially alert, you call it the same way, right? So notice between the two, like the only difference is instead of console.log, you have alert. And it creates this little like pop-up that you have to like manually like click on OK to like close out. So, you know, maybe something that you want to keep in your pocket, but not really useful as a developer. But yeah. Okay. All right, so let's go through this kind of like step-by-step example as we run through this code, and we'll see what happens. So the first thing we do is we initialize we declare and initialize 3 different variables, course, person, and emotion with their corresponding values. And we create one more, sentence. So tying in our ideas of like variable, like referencing variables and also string concatenation, does anyone have an idea of what this will result in? Any guesses? Kelly, do we have a guess of what this could print? Other Kelly, do we have a guess as to what this will assign to sentence? I love what it is. Yes. Is there anything else you want to specify about that? No. Oh yes, Brian.
There will be no spaces.
There will be no spaces. Good job. Oh, also, I forgot to mention, the way we comment in JavaScript is you can use two like forward slashes, and then everything in that same line will just like not be read by the computer. So it's kind of a good way to like make notes and just like not have it be seen by the program. So following that convention, that's why we have this here. But yeah, exactly. So I love Whatita without any spaces because it does not auto space for you. So keep that in mind. And then we call alert on sentence. What do we think will happen? Again, pretty straightforward. It'll give us that like annoying pop-up, outputting our little string here, again, with no spaces as expected. Okay. Oh, man, I expected there to be an animation here. Okay, that's fine. We'll go through it. Basic math, right? So one thing we can do with our variables is use like our operations that we're pretty familiar with. The things that we've seen, plus, minus, to multiply, use an asterisk, and then to divide, you use forward slash. And that'll like operate as expected. This last symbol, does anyone know what this symbol is? I mean, it's a percent sign, but like, does anyone know what it does? So pretty much in like programming, this is called modulus. It's like the modulo operator. And essentially that, like, you probably won't use this, but just to like put it out there, it takes like, it divides one number by the other, right? Except it doesn't like output the actual value, it outputs the remainder. So for example, an easy one to see is like 5 modulo 2. So written as like 5% 2 would give you 1, because 1 would be the remainder. And then just more examples like 5 modulo 0. Anything modulo 0 is always 0. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Okay, but to go through some examples with how we do math in JavaScript. So again, let age, this is our declaration. I'm just going to keep repeating this to like really ingrain and like drill this so we can remember. But let age is our declaration. This equals is telling us that we're about to initialize it, and then 20 plus 5. So pretty intuitive. 20 plus 5 just gives us 25. Nothing like crazy there. And notice here, when we assign age, or sorry, when we reassign the value of age, we don't have to say let again, because once we declare a variable, we've already told the computer that this thing exists. We don't have to say it exists again. We only have to like change its value after that. So notice let age we use here, and age we don't need let. Same deal here, 20 minus 2.5, pretty standard math operations, gives us what we want. And then also multiplication. This kind of ties in one more concept of like actually referencing the variable, as we've seen before. Similar with strings, this will actually give you the value of the variable. So we already see that age has now been updated to 17.5. Therefore, double age will give us 35. Do you have any questions on this? Or any like examples that you're like unsure of, like how it might behave? Okay. Nice. Okay, now we'll get into functions. Let me see. Okay, yeah. So functions have quite a few parts to it, and maybe conceptually like a little difficult, but let's like go through it piece by piece. Again, it's kind of analogous to math. There's a lot of like connections to math. Essentially, we're going to take an input, and then we're going to do something with it, and then we output a value. That's like the core functionality of a function. Yeah, so this is pretty useful if we have a piece of code that's like that we need to write over and over. Like if we continually need to like double a number, or in this case, we need to square a number, instead of writing out like x times x or like number times number, we can literally just define a function and then call it later. So we'll see how we do that. So the basic formatting is pretty like standard. We have function as the keyword. This is like don't change this, it's just function. Literally write out function. Right here is your name. So this should describe what the function does. Typically a verb, because like functions are like actions. Again, make it meaningful. And then within parentheses, we're going to like write out what our parameters are. Parameters is a fancy way of saying like our input or like arguments. These are all like interchangeable terms, but it's essentially like what we expect to be given, what the function should be given at like base level before we even like proceed. So in this case, it's going to take x. Notice this says nothing about the data type of x. Like x could be a string, x could be like a number, but it's kind of implied in the future lines. So as we go down here, within our curly braces, so the curly braces kind of like encapsulate everything that's within, similar to CSS, right? The curly braces indicate like an opening and closing of a block of code. Okay. And then within this function, we have a return value. Return essentially is like saying this is what we're going to output. It like as soon as you see return, the function is done. And return x times x. Yeah, well, it should reference the parameters in some like capacity. In this case, returning x times x does exactly what the function name says. It squares it, and we output it. So let's see how we can make our own functions. So remember, function, the name, a parameter, opening and closing curly brace, and maybe a return value. Okay. So let's just say we want to create a function that returns double our inputted number. Just to get it started, again, following the same conventions as earlier, we have function, double, which, pretty accurately describes what we have here. And instead of x, I just decided to call it n, why not? And our opening brace. Do we have any ideas of like what our return value could be? Or like how we would, let's just like practice like writing it out. Like what would the next line be? Does anyone have any guesses? Yes. So make sure we have our, it's kind of implied, but yeah, return 2 times n. Perfect. And doesn't really take much more than inspection to see that that works. Make sure you close your function with a curly brace, and that's it. So let's say we have a function that returns double our inputted number plus 1. I don't need to like patronize, so let's just go through it because it's pretty simple. If you're like ever unsure of like order of operations, parentheses, just use parentheses. You can like nest them as much as you want, and it's like good to be safe. So this should also do exactly what the function name tells us. Okay, some parts disappeared. That's fine. Okay, so yeah, so using functions, we kind of already covered this. We've defined the function by writing out this block of code, but this alone doesn't like actually use the function. It's just kind of a tool that we've defined and it exists. Yeah, don't worry about this yet. We'll talk about scoping in a second. And then yeah, return value is kind of indicating what we're going to output. So just to see how functions can be called or used, if we have let y, so again, declaring a variable y, and we're about to assign it a value indicated by this equal sign, square 5 is a perfectly valid way of assigning a value to a variable. Essentially what we're saying is we're going to call this function. So now we open this function and like input 5 as our input value. We run through the code. So we see, okay, if we have 5, just to like walk it through, result equals 5 times 5, 25. And we return the results. Therefore, that output value then gets shoved back into here, this little initialization. And now y has 25. That's kind of the process we're going to take when we call functions. Similarly, we can call functions with variables and it'll perform the exact same operations. So remember, y is 25. So when we say let z equals square of y, essentially what's being passed in is the value 25, which then of course goes through the same like machine, gets squared and returned as, what's the square of, something big. But yeah, do we have any questions on this? Because it can be like a little difficult to see like the path that we take here. Otherwise, if it's pretty clear, let's keep going. So using our functions that we've already like defined, does anyone know what this should output? Or like, not know, but like, does anyone have a guess as to what this should output? So far, it's pretty intuitive. Should just be 4. Same thing here. Notice our first number is 4. Therefore, if we call double plus 1, it should be 9. Yeah. Okay. All right. And just to like expand on this just a little, let's say we have our double function once again, not to like be too hard on this, but let's say we have this double function and we want to create a double plus 1 function that uses our currently defined double function. So again, we're going to call this like new double plus 1. Does anyone have any ideas how we can reference or use this function in our current one? This is sort of like an introduction to like abstraction. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. Any guesses? It's like what we could possibly do. We know we have to like return something, but how do we do this? Kelly, who? Do we have any guesses? Oh, right. Okay, cool. Sure. Basically, what we can do is we can call double x and then add 1 to it. Remember, double x, we'll take this x, pass it in here, call this function, return it, and then add 1. So that's kind of the path. I don't mean to get like too confusing, but this is just an example if you want to refer to later. It's okay if it's not like super clear. And again, this is the exact same values and functionality as like the previously defined ones. Cool. Okay. Yeah, so one other thing is functions don't always need a return value. Pretty much what we've seen so far is like we take an input, we do a thing, and we output something. We don't have to do that all the time. We can just like perform some task that doesn't involve an output. In this case, if we call alert greeting within our function, we execute our lines of code. You know, we have greeting howdy plus name. If we were to call show greeting, you know, Miles is name in this case. We concatenate our strings and then we call alert, which should, okay, it doesn't show, but it should like have that pop-up window with howdy Miles. Okay, and I already kind of touched on this, but to comment on JavaScript files, you just use the 2 forward slashes. If you want to comment over multiple lines, you use like /*, whatever you want. And then when you close it, */. That's pretty much it for that. Okay. Oh, type in the chat. Okay, I forgot to update the slide, my bad. But let's just take like a minute to look at this function, try to work through like the logic of how we pass in our variables. And then if you guys can, maybe in like 30 seconds, just let me know what you think this does. At any point, you just like raise your hand and like take a stab at it. Okay, I'm like working through it right now. Okay, does anyone have any guesses? If I were to say like console log or alert something, right? What would that display? Yeah. Yes. Wait, you have? That's crazy. Okay, questions. That's pretty much. Oh, sorry. There's like a little. We'll do questions and then we'll go back to like scoping. Do you have any questions? Okay. Let's jump into the deep end with scoping. Okay, how do I escape? Oh shoot, escape. So let's go back here. All right. Just to preface this, not to like lose your attention, but we're not really going to test on scoping ever, but it's a good concept to know when you write your code and you're like something's going wrong. The idea behind scoping is that when you declare a variable, there's like a certain domain or environment in which it can be referenced or like its variable or its value accessed, right? So if I were to like say, like, for example, I'm not sure if this is the best analogy. Okay, let's consider this room as like an environment, like a local environment. If I were to like scream right now or like say something, it would only be heard by like the people in this same environment. So if that's a variable, it's only accessible within here. If I were to ask someone who's like in Wheeler right now what I said, they would not know. So that's kind of like the humanized analogy to like what scoping is. But the idea is with code, we can kind of see it differently. So going back, we saw that we could use like let name equals Joe. For this sake, we're going to use var. Var has a scoping that's kind of like buggy and can have like unexpected behavior, which is why we say just don't use it. The idea is like you can define something out here. So name Joe, sure. And then within your function, you define like a friend variable, right? So name is declared outside all the functions. This is like if you were to announce something like outside, sure. And it can be accessed like anywhere. Friend is like local within a function. I guess, again, that analogy, maybe like within a very specific room. So now if we try to access friend outside of the function, similar to like what I kind of implied, okay, wait, it's not gonna. If you were to call like alert function, or sorry, alert friend right here, it should throw an error because it doesn't see friend globally. Friend was defined within the function. The issue with var is if you define, you can like redeclare name here, and that like overrides this name, which might not be what you want. Because like as our code gets like really long, if somewhere we define name and we like use that same name in a function, it'll like cause some like errors that you don't want. So the idea is like let is preferred because it's block scoped. The idea behind block is like everything within a curly brace, within an opening and closing curly brace, is like a block of code. So everything within that can be accessed within that. Anything outside cannot access what's within it. So this kind of keeps things separate and like compartmentalized. Again, you don't really need to know exactly why that's important. Just know that let is preferred. And then the last thing is const. Const is like short for constant. Previously, we've seen the ability to like reassign values to variables. But const is a keyword that tells the program like, okay, once we initialize it, once we give it a value, that's not changing. And so that'll be useful because as a programmer, if you're like trying to change something that should be constant, you just like are lazy or you like forget. It should throw an error and let you know like, hey, something's wrong. You weren't supposed to do that. So again, it doesn't really add, using const, let, and var, using one over the other doesn't like change the functionality of your website. It's just like, it's more so on your end as the like architect of this website, what'll make your life easier. And what will make your life easier is if you use let. So I'll not like speak on this further because it's like kind of complicated. Just use let. Do you have questions on like the block scoping? Because since we're only using let, it's important to know at least how let is used. Do you have any questions? I mean, at this point, I'll just like open the floor for questions regarding like anything we covered. If not, I think we're good to move on to the design portion of today, which should be led by, oh, sorry, what's up?
Can you use name inside the function?
Yeah, okay, so with let, yeah, exactly. So if I were to say like let friend equals maybe name, right? For example, I could do that. I could say let friend equals name, and because, wait a minute. Give me a second. Let me think about this. I'm pretty sure you can go like, you can access things outside of the curly braces. You just can't redeclare them. Let me just make sure though. Give me like a sec. But yeah, I'm pretty sure if you were to say like let friend equals name within this function, like right here, even though it's in the braces and it's like separate from this, we went like inward, right? So by going inward, we're able to like reference it. But just to make sure I'm not like spreading misinformation, give me a sec. While I'm looking, does anyone have any other questions? Like anything, because JavaScript is like, it'll only get more like used from now on. So we're going to like establish a solid foundation. So please get the questions out now so that we can avoid that confusion in the future. Okay, wait, let me just open it on here. So what do we have? If you check the speaker notes on these lectures, you'll see that I'm like pretty much, okay, oh, why does he look like that? That won't be you. That will not be you if you know your scoping. Let's go to let. So I'm pretty sure, okay. Right. Okay, that's not, okay, they don't really say. I'm like 99% sure it works. I think this article does a decent job of like illustrating the like advantages of let. The idea is like, notice how we have like 2 let greetings. I said I wouldn't talk about scoping, but here I am. But yeah, so we have let greeting equals say hi, and that's like global. If we redeclare let greeting, if we like redeclare it within this like little block, this like curly brace, greeting is say hello instead, right? It's what we assigned within the block. But then as soon as we exit it and we try to access greeting globally, it takes on this global value. So that's only if you redeclare it, but I'm pretty sure you can update it. yeah, I'm gonna stick with that. I'm pretty sure you can update it, but if you redeclare, it's like its own variable. But yeah, good question. Really had me stumped. If you have any other questions. Okay, cool. Yeah. Kelly, are you good? Cool. Are you gonna use that?
Yeah, I'll just use, is this yours? Okay. Okay. Today we are starting with human-centered design. Okay, so oh shit. Okay, before we start, how many of you are familiar with the term human-centered design? Just to raise your hand. Okay, less than I expected, but that's great. Today we'll be doing a brief introduction into what human-centered design is and how you can apply it to web design. So this introduction, if you are already familiar with the definition, will be more prototyping / like back end, or not back end, but like the later half of human-centered design, since this isn't like a research-centric course. But I'll be going through the entire process and how you can apply it to web design and creating apps. So what is human-centered design? We can abbreviate this as HCD, just because it's a pretty long term, but essentially human-centered design is a design approach / process that incorporates a human perspective into any type of design. So it's not specific to technology or web interfaces or mobile interfaces in any way. We can apply it anywhere, but in the scope of this course, we are going to be applying it to web solutions and web designs. So yeah, in a nutshell, we want to consider what works best for humans and design with this mindset in mind. Why HCD? Why do we choose this process? Essentially, there are a lot of different design practices out there, but this one is probably one of the more popular ones. It's pretty standard across a lot of design agencies and just in general, good practice in industry these days. But we choose HCD because we want to be able to empathize with others and understand how humans and our users work and can help us design things that are actually useful and effective. So I think we've kind of like alluded to this concept a little bit throughout the course, i.e. like what makes a product actually applicable and helpful for your end user and what that means in the lens of web design. And so that's pretty much why it's important. You know, you don't want to be making a crappy website for someone who like won't be using it and not understand your users in the way that you will end up designing that website. So here is an overview of HCD. We typically start with analysis or research is what it's typically called. And then going into design and then evaluation and then implementation. This process tends to vary a little bit. I would say this is more of a process that's more design heavy in terms of like focusing on getting the design out there and then testing it with users and then implementing it again. But an important thing to note is that HCD is not linear. It may seem linear here because you have those 4 processes or 4 stages. But an important thing about HCD is that we are always iterating on our past decisions. So as you can see with the little arrows, we are always jumping between processes and making sure that we are validating our decisions with the users in mind. So if you're in the design phase, you know, and you validate with a user and they don't like it or it's not useful, you might have to go back to the analysis phase, for example, and then the process kind of is cyclical in that way and non-linear. So to break it down a little bit, analysis usually consists of user research, so defining the problem space. Again, this isn't a research course, so we won't be teaching you how to like do user research necessarily, but a really quick way to validate your thoughts through analysis or do user research is literally just by asking people around you. So if you are designing an app for students, for example, you can like maybe ask your roommate or someone in your class in like CS class, if it's specifically for CS students, and just like get their thoughts on what you think or they think a product would be useful. And in this phase, we are essentially defining the problem space and creating an opportunity for our website to exist in this like vast ecosystem of websites. Next is design. So it's also known as like the ideation phase, where you are coming up with different ideas for how your website might look or how it might function. So in this phase, you're actually going into Figma and like other drawing or prototyping softwares and kind of drawing out what your application might look like. This is also usually the phase that you tend to go back to a lot, because you want to make sure that your design is the most useful and user-centric as possible. Next is user testing. So once you actually design a product, typically we'll actually go and seek users to let them test it out and kind of see if it's the most intuitive way for them to use it. And this step is actually repeated a lot in industry and just in general with like all the popular apps you see out there, like, I don't know, Uber, DoorDash, Spotify. It's constantly being user tested over and over again. And just like even with the user base that it already has, there are lots of problems that exist. So these companies are often going back and fixing those mistakes. And that's what design really is at the end of the day. It's kind of like evaluating what the core needs of the user are and how we can replicate that in the interface. So that's kind of what the evaluation phase is like. And then finally, we have the actual prototyping and fabrication phase, which is where you will build it out and apply those changes when they come about. And like I mentioned, things may go back and forth, but that is typically the last stage of the process where you're building it into actuality based on all this evaluation that you did. So to start with user research, just as a brief breakdown, like I mentioned, user research can be like really involved or it can be really easy, like just asking a friend, for example. But if you want to get really, I guess, formal with it, you can do interviews. We like to, this is a really great practice of user research, creating an interview guide for the specific users that are using your website. For example, you can talk about their stories and their experiences and really like shadow the process of how they might use a certain application for a certain purpose. So if you have a problem, let's say like, oh, there aren't enough food delivery services in Berkeley, maybe you'd interview a student, ask them like, oh, what are their pain points that they face with this process? What times of the day do they need like food delivery, et cetera, et cetera. So like a one-on-one talk with someone that might be using your product. Other things include surveys, so like much more large / like neutral scan of things where you can get a larger quantitative data around certain questions that you might be wondering. Card sorting is also pretty popular, where you can observe how users reflect on their experiences. It's essentially where you group ideas by like different categories. You can get into this in your own time. And then we also have things like deck research, which is just like secondary research scanning, and then ethnographic research, which is more observational focused. Essentially, yeah, that was a lot. You don't necessarily need to know it for this class, but the rules of thumb when you are doing research and understanding your users is to be empathetic, really put yourselves into their shoes. A lot of the times it's easy for you to make assumptions about, you know, what a user might like about a product or like in a web interface. But when you actually go and talk to people, that might not be the case. So as a designer and a developer, it's important to practice this concept of empathy and really understand like who will be using the application and how you can optimize for that. Other things include neutrality and simplicity. These two kind of play around in terms of like minimalism and not overthinking the process a lot. Typically, we want to strive for things that are most intuitive. So playing like an equal playing ground between like the different sides of the spectrum in the case of like opposing opinions is important, as well as making sure that things are easy to use. Okay, so how can we define a problem in the first place? We talked a little bit about like how to do research, but how can we identify like that a problem actually exists? Typically, we use the statement, how might we, also abbreviated as HMW. Oh, I guess, yeah. In terms of that, that's a question that we often might ask when we are dealing with a certain problem space or difficulty in making a product. So for example, if I'm dealing with the food delivery service, I might ask, how might we design an application for Berkeley students to order late night food easier. So that's like a definition of a problem that exists and how you can better frame a design for a product in that lens. Next is the ideation phase. So this is kind of where you get into actually designing the app and figuring out what it will look like and translating the research into interface and visual design. The first thing you should do is synthesize your findings. So once you've done your research, are there any clear groups of users with similar experiences? Typically, if you have like a large breadth of research, there's going to be a lot of different people with a lot of different experiences. So this is where you have to choose one that is most priority or most important or more significant for your problem space. So something useful is to make personas and characters that represent each group. Here's an example of some personas that are used in user research. You don't have to worry about making these or anything, but it's a helpful way to illustrate a typical or stereotypical user in your product's problem space. So if I'm dealing with the food delivery service, maybe one of my personas is like a CS kid who's typically in Moffitt very late, for example. And my persona might illustrate that by detailing their pain points, what problems they face, and what their needs might be. And yeah, in terms of other synthesis methods, you should also try to make journey maps. So these are ways of timelining the user's experience. So when we think of like a website or like a typical user flow, we'll have different steps in that phase, right? So what if like I'm ordering food, I'll have like the need to search for something and then actually check out in the process. So making a journey map of either that process or the process of like a psychological user's case in terms of how they will stumble upon this app, how they'll interact with it, and how they'll search for things is super helpful as well. And here's an example of a journey map where you can kind of section out the different phases of a typical journey in the app. And this is actually a really good practice that I think for your final projects would be helpful. If you have like a specific final end goal, a journey map is a really interesting way of illustrating what the steps would take to get to that goal. So it looks like in this case, Jumping Jamie is the persona and her scenario is to switch her current mobile plan. So in this case, if you're trying to switch to a different mobile plan, the different steps outlined are to define. So essentially reviewing the current plan and defining the parameters for a new plan. And the next stage is to compare. So comparing different phone plans and like watching videos to see which ones are the best. And then we have negotiating. So maybe this persona wants to like call competitors and like see what price is the best and like really find the best offer, and then finally selecting a phone plan. So that's an example of like how you would outline the steps for what the user would take in a product's journey. And then finally, when you actually want to identify what the key problem that your product is going to solve is, you can find the key insights of the personas and the journey maps, narrow down those ideas, and make affinity maps to group those ideas and observations. This is kind of like a secondary step. I wouldn't like prioritize it too much, but more applicable when you have like a large breadth of research. This is an example of what affinity map might look like. Again, it's like a lot of information and not super applicable to this class, but it's a method to kind of narrow down a large breadth of research and identify what the main problems may be. And to summarize, some of the rules of thumb are to be empathetic. So, identify those user needs and really prioritize that over what you think might be cool. So when you're designing your websites, if you think something is like really dope or like might look really cool, take a step back and think about what like a user of this website would need. Next is to be observant. So look for trends and repetition, edge cases, emotions of what the whole problem space might be. So yeah, that's pretty self-explanatory. Next is to be open. So what haven't you considered yet? A lot of times it's easy to get boxed in. So thinking about what holes that might exist in your research is really key. And then finally, being inclusive. So we talked a lot about accessibility in the past. This is important in both a like design and research method lens. So for example, we talked about like thumb tapping and like mobility and color contrast. Those are all really, really important things to keep in mind for the interface, but also in terms of research, making sure that you include minorities or like groups that might not have been considered yet in your problem scope. And then finally, we have user testing. So some methods of user testing include literally just grabbing people like that you know and like asking them to use your app if they fit into the user group. But also some quick user testing tactics include guerrilla testing, which is literally just going up to random people in public and like asking them to test your product. This kind of opens up the sample space a little bit, so it's not biased to like your friends and your family. And also like that introduces bias because you know they're friends and your family. And then in terms of more in-depth testing, you can also like generate a list of questions that you want to ask your testers, like if you want specific feedback on things, or like supervise them when they actually use the tasks. So these are a couple of ways that you can validate your designs and get some feedback on if it's intuitive and like see if they're struggling with any use cases, for example. Here's an example of how this might be applied in like a prototyping and fabrication way. Testing is like extremely relevant in physical products too, because obviously you want to like be able to stress test things and like see if things will break or like just overall test the functionality of like what it means to physically interact with the product. So if you want to kind of like put yourselves in a different lens, this is a really interesting way of seeing why user testing is really important in a digital way as well. So yeah, obviously if something isn't designed well, it'll like literally break if it's a physical product. And the same can be said for a digital product as well. If you can't do something, then the whole point of your product is useless. Here is how it might look like to kind of map out a flow when you're doing testing. So on your Figma files, if you have a lot of screens or like different features in your app, typically you'll need to map out the interactions between different screens and like what the prototype might look like. But obviously we don't necessarily want to force you guys to like make a whole prototype to test. So this is also an easy way to just like quickly validate your ideas with someone else, like creating arrows to draw the user between like, oh, I envision that if you click this button, it'll go to the screen. This is like a lower cost / lower effort way of getting your ideas out there to people. Here are some other examples of just like how you can apply this whole iteration / like design focused mindset to human-centered design and the different types of products that might exist at the end of the day. So we have like a physical solution and a digital solution. Yeah, so the whole idea of iteration is to optimize things. So this is like a really useful phrase in terms of like iterate for optimization. So the whole point of going back to revisit your old ideas is to, at the end of the day, optimize for what the best solution might be. Yeah, here's another overview of the process. We want to consider each of these phases at least once when you're going through your product creation cycle. And it's really important to kind of keep the user in mind at all stages. Yeah, that pretty much ends the lecture. Does anyone have any questions before we end off? Okay, let's do attendance. What should the word be recorded? Oh. Where is it?